Hey everyone, this is Pooja Chilukuri, your host for the Afterlife podcast, and I'm very excited to interview my guest today, Mark Anthony, JD, psychic explorer, also known as the psychic lawyer. Mark is a fourth generation psychic medium. He is an Oxford educated attorney licensed to practice law in Florida, Washington, D.C., and before the United States Supreme Court. Mark travels to mystical locations in remote corners of the world to examine ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena. Mark also appears nationwide on TV and radio, including CBS TV's The Doctors show, Gaia TV's Beyond Belief, and Great Day Houston. Mark also co-hosts the livestream show The Psychic and the Doc on Transformation Network, and he is a featured speaker at conferences, expos, and universities, which include Brown, Columbia, Harvard, and Yale. Mark is a featured columnist for Best Holistic Life magazine, and he is the author of 3 best-selling books. His latest book, The Afterlife Frequency, is the gold winner of the Cover Visionary Awards and was up for the Pulitzer Prize and ranked as one of the top books about faith in God, and is up for an Emmy Award for Best Metaphysical Book of the Year 2022. His other best-selling books are Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you, Pooja. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for having me.
I'm honored to get to interview you. I love this show that I'm doing because I get to interview people whose books have impacted and touched me deeply. And your book, I have to talk about it during this show because I have so many questions. But before we get into it, I would never put the words psychic and lawyer together. Like, my brain has a hard time wrapping around those two words. How did that happen?
You know, it's so funny because the media loves to give me labels. And I was in New York City at a media conference, and I was there in my capacity as a medium. And a couple of the reporters said, "Wait a second, you're a lawyer? This guy's a lawyer?" They go, "He's the psychic lawyer." And so all of a sudden it got labeled. But before that, I was born a medium. Both of my parents had these abilities. And like you indicated on the intro, I'm a 4th generation psychic medium. I have tracked these abilities back 4 generations to the early 1900s. I'm assuming it goes further than that, but the stories simply aren't there. And a lot of the people that I had to talk to were in their 80s and 90s when they revealed the stories. And the 2 sides of my family could not possibly have been more different. My dad, he came from he was a Baptist, but he was a Pennsylvania Baptist, a Northern Baptist. And he had 4 siblings, 3 sisters and a brother. And one of his sisters, Marjorie, was a medium like he was. They could see and hear spirits. But then again, so was their mother, Isabel, and their maternal grandmother, Grace. And my dad said that it was all kind of very hush hush. And every Thursday, they lived in this big house, and the parlor was off limits because they lived in a rural area. So my dad was out, taking care of the animals and stuff. And he came in and he was listening through the parlor. And the official story was the ladies are over playing bridge. Well, when he was listening through the doors, he realized that his sister Marjorie, his mother Isabel, and his grandmother Grace were conducting readings for a bunch of ladies in the community, but they all said they were playing bridge so that nobody would find out. And then later on, my dad says, I see spirits too. And they're like, okay. Well, meanwhile, over in New Jersey, there was my mother, an incredibly gifted psychic medium. Mom was the whole package. And her maternal grandmother, which would be my great grandmother, her name was Giovanna. And Giovanna emigrated from Italy, and she was known in the Italian community of Little Italy and North New Jersey as the woman who knows things. And people from all walks of life, particularly officials from the Catholic Church, would come and meet with Giovanna. She used to, when nuns, young nuns, poor girls, were coming over from Italy, Giovanna would house them and help them get settled, and so to make the transition to the convent easier. Cardinals, bishops, priests were in and out of the house recently. And see, in the Catholic side of the family, this was looked at as a vision of the Holy Spirit, the gift of second sight. So it was treated with great reverence. And in 2016, PBS did a special called The Italian Americans. It was, I believe it was a 4-hour special. It was 2 nights in a row. And they actually did an entire segment on Giovanna, and they referenced her psychic abilities. And I'll never forget when it was on, you know, my cousins, we all knew about it. Every commercial break, we were on the phone. Did you see that? And but it was really nice for it to finally be brought out into the open and treated with the dignity and respect that Giovanna, my mother, my dad, and his family deserved. And when people think of mediums, and I'm glad you said, you know, putting lawyer and psychic together. Well, my dad was a U.S. Navy SEAL, okay? And he had these abilities. My mom was a commercial illustrator. And then after my dad got out of the Navy, he said he was at a USO dance. And he said, so here he is, he's a 22, 23-year-old sailor, all full of himself. And he said, I saw this foxy looking dame. And he meant my mother, okay? And she was in fashion and illustration at a high-end department store. And mom said, well, she got all the designer clothes at wholesale. So she was always dressed to the nine. And dad thought she was like 30. I think she was only 19. Anyway, they started talking and they clicked immediately. And on the third date, my mother said, there's something you need to know before we go before we get to know each other any further. She said, I see spirits. And my dad used a number of expletives that only a sailor could said, I do too. And so years later, I come along, and I have an older brother and an older sister who are very spiritual, and they are very sensitive things, but apparently I got the whole genetic package, because at about 3.5, I start interacting with spirits. And my mom's reaction was like, oh, he's got it. My dad's was like, oh, Lord, he's got it. Because they were afraid, he was afraid that I'd be mistreated. And so as I got older, I had planned to go into the clergy. I was very interested in actually becoming a priest. But I felt that, and based on the discussions that we had at home, that religion was too narrow, and that God is so much broader than any one dogma. And so I also felt there were too many rules and regulations in the clergy. So I ended up in law. And it's like kind of like jumping out of the rule-laden frying pan into the regulatory fire. And so that's how I became the psychic lawyer.
I'm listening to you. If you see me smiling and laughing, I'm not laughing at you, Mark. I just can't get over the irony. You mentioned so many words that don't go together in my head. Navy SEAL, illustrator, Baptist, Catholic, psychic, medium.
Well, it's funny, when I started Catholic school, because I went to Catholic school and I started first grade when I was 5. My dad said, don't tell anyone about this. And I thought, okay, this would be fun, because they were talking about angels and saints and all these spirits. And I'm like, oh, this is the right place. And then I started hearing other things. So I realized pretty quick, just talk to mom and dad about this.
I'm so glad you had parents that understood, because that was actually one of my questions was it hard? Because I know, you don't necessarily fit in with the other kids, but I'm so glad you had your family. Yes. Yeah.
There isn't a day that goes by that my parents are in spirit now. I thank them every day. It wasn't easy. Everybody in the neighborhood, they kind of looked at us as the weird family, but kind of like cool weird.
Yeah.
And people started knowing about my mom, And because mom would meet people and she'd just like tell them something like, how do you know that? and but it's very difficult. It's hard enough being a kid, but when you're really different, that makes it even harder. And it was great having my parents there because they guided me very well.
Yes, I got bits of that from your book, which I really loved, your interactions with your dad that you talk about in there. But so with great power comes great responsibility, right? Like the whole quote from Spider-Man. So is that why I mean, what has prompted you to do this full time? Because you still do have that law degree, right? You're licensed to practice before the Supreme Court. I mean,
yes, I do. And what happened, I was in my law office one day and I was thinking about spaghetti. Number one, I'm a guy, we're always hungry. All right. Number two, I'm Italian, so thinking about spaghetti isn't a weird thing. But the phone rings and my assistant said, your mom's on line one, and I take the call. And she goes, hey, honey, I made spaghetti. Do you want to come over for lunch? And my parents lived about 5 miles from my law office. And I thought, oh, what the heck? I'll go see mom and dad. And I got there and we had a beautiful lunch. She made broccoli rabe and sauce. And she goes, eat this. It's good for your blood. Lots of iron, And mom looked tired that day. And I was concerned. But we were joking and laughing. And before I left, Pooja, let me see if I can get through telling this without kind of getting very emotional. She hugged me and kissed me and said, Mark, I love you so much. I'm so happy that you're my son. And I was like, well, mom, I love you too. And I hugged her and kissed her. And when I left, I remember like when the door closed, it just had this very ominous sound to it. And it was beautiful, but something didn't feel right. And the next morning I was in court and the judge's assistant came to me and said, Mark, we need you in chambers right now. And when I went into chambers, they handed me the phone. My secretary was in tears and she said, your father called, your mother died. And I was devastated. She had what's known as a ventricular fibrillation. She got up that morning, she put on a pot of coffee, and then she laid down on the couch, went to sleep, and drifted off. So she had a very peaceful passing. But be that as it may, I was devastated. And I spiraled into this horrific depression. And anybody listening who's lost somebody you love, a parent, sibling, friend, spouse, God forbid, a child, knows what I'm talking about. And it was a couple weeks after she passed, Pooja, I was heading back from court to my law office. And also one of those waves of grief hit me. And I realized, let me pull over. So I pull over in this parking lot of a convenience store. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm a senior partner of a law firm. I got to get my act together. I can't walk into the office, tears and all that, because, people say stuff and everything. And all of a sudden, this flash of light went off. And I looked to the passenger side seat and I see my mother's silhouette in this silver white light. And just for a second, and then I hear her voice, Mark, you've been given the gift of mediumship so that you would not be crushed by grief. But now you must help those who are suffering with theirs. So Pooja, I'm trying to process that. And then another wave of messages come through in her voice again. She said, Mark, your life's mission is to help people understand that God exists, that heaven exists, that souls are immortal living spirits, that we can communicate with souls, and that we will all be reunited when it is your time to leave the material world and enter the light that is called God. I mean, I'm drenched in sweat and I sink back into my seat and all I can say is, okay. I mean, I was so overwhelmed. And then I'm like, oh my God, I can't tell anybody this. They're going to think I'm insane. But then once the fear subsided, I also realized this was a life-changing event. And after that, everything changed. And a few weeks after that, I was offered a job at a government agency overseeing court operations. That was interesting. So I segued out of the practice of law because that's a 24/7 kind of not kind of, it's a 24/7 job. And then I started work on my book, Never Letting Go, and within 9 months, Never Letting Go had been released, and I was my manager Rocky, who travels with me. She got me a gig in New York City where I was on MSNBC and talking about spirit communication, and then she got me a speaking engagement at Harvard. And so we're walking around Harvard, and it was not long before Christmas. And I remember we had steaming cups of cocoa, and it was cold, and all the red brick and ivy. It was like, it was Harvard. And all of a sudden my phone rings, and it's my boss, the elected official. You're taking too much time off work. The political party, guess which one, is complaining about me having a medium on staff. And he's going on and on and on and on and on. And I said, well, then I'll make it easy for you. He goes, how so? I go, please accept my resignation. I quit. He goes, oh, okay. And I hung up the phone, and then I go, oh my God, Rocky, I just quit the practice of law. And she said, Mark, look around you. Where are you? Harvard. She goes, and what are you doing in an hour? I said, giving a lecture on the afterlife and signing copies of my book, Never Letting Go. She said, don't you think this is exactly where you're supposed to be? And I've never looked back.
That's incredible. It's a very personal story. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm glad that you haven't looked back, because I know you've helped, I don't know, thousands at this point, I think, and Mark, you've helped me. Your book has helped me, because I grew up with a very fundamentalist kind of, I grew up religious, and then I transferred into a very fundamentalist type religious, for lack of a better word, group, I guess. And one of the things, the word psychic and the word medium, I used to actually fear that. I am one of those people. So, for me to be having this conversation with you today, I think it's nothing but a miracle. And for those that might still have that fear, and I think how many people are helped by this? Do you find that it helps people process their grief? And can you also speak to that fear part a little bit?
There's so much to that question, which is one of the reasons, and that question is addressed in all three of my books, Never Letting Go, Evidence of Eternity, and of course, very much so in the Afterlife Frequency. Religions get very caught up in using fear, particularly when it comes to psychic phenomenon. And Christians I know, or religious fanatics who pose as Christians, start saying, well, according to Leviticus 19, mediums are not of God, and Deuteronomy chapters 10 through, Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 through 13, mediums are not of God, don't consult with them. And I said, yes, but you need to read the entire passage. And if you go to Deuteronomy 18 verses 21 through 22, it says, how do we know if a prophet speaks, is of God? Mm-hmm. And in the Old Testament, when the term prophet is used, that would be what we call psychic, because they're receiving information from supernatural means. And it says, if what the prophet says does not come true, then it is not of God. So basically, Deuteronomy 18 sets truth as the standard. So if what is received comes true or is truthful, then it is of the divine. And then let's go to the New Testament. One of my favorite passages, the first book of Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 4 through 12, and it sets out the gifts that the divine, that God gives all of us. And two of those gifts are prophecy and discernment of spirits. And all of these gifts come from one and the same spirit, which is God. And then the Apostle Paul also writes in Romans 12, verses 6 through 8, that we all have gifts from God. And if your gift is one of prophecy, then prophesize in accordance with your faith. So what happens is religions like to use fear to control people. Don't talk to those people. Like I was at this, it was supposedly a Hindu ashram, but it was actually a cult. And they had this figure, and I won't mention her name, she has passed, but they said she does not approve of psychics. And I'm like, why? Because we can see what a fraud she is. And people were groveling on their stomachs to kiss her feet. And somebody said, she's the earthly incarnation of the goddess Lakshmi. And I'm like, no, she isn't. And I could see how she was manipulating and controlling people. And so it's not just Christianity that does that. Other religions do this, and it's all about fear. The truth is, we can all connect with the divine directly. Now, that being said, faith plays an important role, and religion does play an important role when we keep in mind that religion's teachings are about peace, love, understanding, and healing. But when people hijack a religion to justify anger, bigotry, hatred, and violence, it is no longer about God. It is now about the human ego edging God out. And so if you find comfort, solace, and inner peace and a connection to the divine through religion, then absolutely. But if the people that are manipulating your religion and religious services, that the term God-fearing is the most, there's nothing to fear from God. God is love, energy, the quantum energy that links all of us. And so psychic ability and mediumship, the ability to communicate with the other side and to discern future events, is nothing to be afraid of. Scripture is filled with people who do that. And when in the Bible, when we're good guys, we're prophets. When they say we're bad, we're witches and mediums and those type of things. And I give a lecture where I go through and I discuss many of the figures in Scripture like Joseph. When the Pharaoh is having dreams of the 7 fat cows that emerged from the Nile River, only to be devoured by 7 skinny cows, 7 fat ears of corn, only to be devoured by 7 skinny ears. And all the viziers and advisors to the court of the Pharaoh couldn't interpret this. But the Hebrew, Joseph, was brought before Pharaoh, and he had the gift of discernment, and he interpreted that for Pharaoh, that there'd be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph is a key figure in Judaism and Christianity. And that's just one example. I could go on and on and on. But the thing is, all the religions have people with psychic and mediumistic abilities in them. If you look at the saints through the Catholic Church, so many of them exhibit psychic and mediumistic activity. St. Clare of Assisi, she lived 800 years ago, is the patron saint of television. Now, why is that? Well, she was also a very close associate of St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis is cool. He's kind of an interfaith saint. And we could do a whole show just on St. Francis. But he would go into deep states of prayer, and he developed stigmata, where he would bleed from his hands and his feet and his side, mimicking the wounds of Christ on the cross. His good friend, St. Anthony of Padua, could lecture in languages he never even knew. And his lecturing was to spread the gospel. This is what we call channeling, in Britain, transmediumship. But St. Clare, she got so ill, she couldn't go to Mass. She couldn't leave her room in the convent, so she would pray to God for her to see what was happening in Mass, and she would see it in real time. That was remote viewing. It's used by the CIA, the Russians, the French, the British, the Chinese. I mean, every secret service in the world has a remote viewing division. And so in 1958, Pope Pius XII designated her the patron saint of television because she was receiving visions of something happening far away in real time. So don't tell me that the Vatican and all these religions don't know about these abilities and realize that they are often used for good and healing and positive things. Religion is a double-edged sword, shall we say.
It definitely is, Mark. And thank you for those explanations, because I think it's all about the power struggle, right? And even in your book, one of the things you mention is, like you said, we all have the power to connect with the divine. But you also say something in your book that's interesting to me. You say that we all have the capacity and the power to connect with the spirits. We may not all be mediums, but that there are certain signs, that there's something called spiritual awareness. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, spiritual situational awareness is one of the terms that I introduce in the book. Now, my dad was a Navy SEAL, so he taught me be aware. That was Dad's mantra. Yeah. And in this day and age, it's very wise to be aware when you walk into a public place. And situational awareness is being aware of what's going on around you 360 degrees. All right, where's the exits? Look at the people. And I'm not saying, be paranoid or prejudicial, but be aware. So many people are walking around staring at their cell phone with these things in their ears. They're completely blocked off to what's going on around them. Take the earbuds out, put the cell phone down, pay attention. Now, that's situational awareness, a highly valued skill used by military, first responders, and spiritual situational awareness expands that to feeling spiritual presence. And in the afterlife frequency, I introduced the term the electromagnetic soul. And the EMS, the electromagnetic soul, is what we really are, which is pure energy that is consciousness and eternal electromagnetic energy. Everything is made of molecules. We know that from science. We also know molecules are made from atoms. Atoms, in turn, are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which in turn are made of the smallest particle of electromagnetic energy called a quantum. That's where the term quantum physics comes from. So everything, and that includes this pen, me, the radio waves this show is being broadcast on, the light of the sun, the rings of Saturn, are all on the most subatomic level electromagnetic energy. And so our soul, which is consciousness, is electromagnetic energy, because we know from the field of neuroscience, which is the study of the human brain, the brain has an electrical field, okay? And when that field ceases to function, it's like a computer hard drive that crashes and all the data gets uploaded to the cloud. Well, that's what happens when we die. And the joke I like to make is you go to Dropbox if you're Catholic and Microsoft Cloud if you're Protestant. I mean, just making a joke there, okay? Because I've made that joke and some people get offended, and it's like, come on, lighten up, get the lightning bolt out of your, nose. But the thing is, we know from the laws of thermodynamics and physics that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. Every great spiritual teacher, from the sages of ancient India through Zoroaster to Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Muhammad, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Native American spirituality, the religions of the Pacific, all teach that the who and what we are, soul, spirit, consciousness, pre-exists the body, comes into the body, leaves when the body dies. So in the afterlife frequency, I reconcile faith and science to prove that there is no incompatibility. And this isn't just some hocus pocus random thing I've come up with. I've based my research on years of study, and also some of the top quantum physicists in the world, including Michio Kaku, said recently that eternal life does not violate the laws of physics. And so the electromagnetic soul theory explains not only the afterlife, but spirit communication, because my EMS is in my head, and the EMSs of spirits, they align their frequency with mine so we can talk. It also explains a near-death experience, deathbed visions, shared death experiences, out-of-body experiences. It explains all of that. And that's what makes the afterlife frequency different than any other book on this topic, because generally, Pooja, the different forms of spirit communication, be it mediumship, NDEs, near-death experiences, SDs, shared death experience, DBVs, deathbed visions, OBEs, out-of-body experiences, are all treated like salad bar. They're all in different canisters, but they're not. Energetically, they all have the same foundation and all operate on the same principles. And the electromagnetic soul, my electromagnetic soul theory, explains this.
It really does. And can I say something, Mark? So the book jumped at me because I was browsing your website and I saw your books, and this one really spoke to me, jumped at me, because again, with my background, I am trained in scientific research, and also, with the religious conditioning that I had from the past, I needed to break that barrier, and all the scientific language you used in the book really helped me. But the book was such an entertaining read. Like I was like, do I want to read a book written by a lawyer? Because I was worried about, getting caught.
It being like a law book.
I'm reading it for the second time and loving it. So
I've always liked good stories.
Yeah.
I've always liked good stories, and a lot of what I'm talking about is very, very technical, but if it is presented in a way that's entertaining, my manager Rocky calls what I do edutainment. I educate and entertain. And I also used to, in the practice of law, when I would try cases, I used to like to keep the, not that I would get up into a comedy routine in front of a jury, because judges tend not to have great senses of humor or patience with that. But I have had to read so many boring books in the practice of law that I vowed I would never do that to my readers. So I try to write my books the way Michael Crichton does, or the way Mario Puzo does. These are some of my favorite authors. Teach people, but then illustrate with stories.
Yes. And I really appreciate what you've done, because the other thing that I was surprised, I didn't find anything woo-woo in the book. Like, you've broken down everything in very scientific terms. So thank you for doing that. I think it's time to bridge that gap, because I really believe that we don't have all the answers. And sometimes we do need to connect with that other side, because that gives us the complete picture. We are mind, body, spirit, right? We can't ignore that part of us.
No, we can't. And I remember when I was 8 years old, I was with my dad and we were looking at the stars. And my dad was my hero because he was an aerospace engineer and he worked with astronauts. And it was like dad was cool. And we were looking at the stars and we were talking about this. And he said, Mark, there's no such thing as a mystery. There are only questions for which we do not yet have answers. And if you put enough research, enough focus, enough funding into anything, eventually you're going to come up with a solution and an answer. And it will be based on science. And that's my approach, is that spirit communication isn't woo-hoo, because people go, that's the work of the devil. Okay, people immediately fear. Okay, fear has a face, demons, devils, and all this. And when you start understanding how spirit communication works, that immediately goes away. Understanding is the key to enlightenment, is opening up your mind. And like the other day, I was having dinner with some of my Jewish friends, and one of them said, well, I'd love to get a reading with you, but my rabbi said we are not supposed to know. And I go, now, isn't that convenient? So why did God give you a brain that makes you think and makes you question? And why does God give us the capacity to explain and understand these things? I said, that's a Bronze Age mentality. And I mean, come on, religion's based in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. What other facets of our lives do we limit to a Bronze and Iron Age understanding? Jesus did not say, go forth and be ignorant. I mean, he was a guy that rocked the world with his teachings. Buddha did too, and it's an ongoing path of understanding. Life is a journey, not a destination. And a dear friend of mine, a fellow medium, Rhonda Schwartz, she said that we have but one life, and it's eternal. So our journey through the physical aspect of life is just that. It's part of our journey.
Journey, yes. And while I was listening to you, Mark, something else popped in my head. When I was a kid, I had this fantasy that if someone died, there would be a phone somewhere that we could just dial a number and talk to them. Yeah. And come to find out, oh, we have mediums. They could do that. They can help us with that. But actually, when I was reading your book, the foreword was, I think he's your friend, Dr. Schwartz. And yes, they're working on a soul phone. That was crazy to me.
Yes, he is. I was recently with Dr. Schwartz at the University of Arizona's Laboratory for the Advancement of Consciousness and Health. And Rhonda Schwartz is his wife, who is a medium. Right. And I was part of the Soul Phone Mediumship Summit. And Dr. Schwartz got together who he considers the 6 top mediums in the country and I can't tell you any more than that, but I've seen the soul phone. I've seen what they're working on, and we are within grasp. We are within technological grasp of a technological device, which will be able to directly communicate with spirits. Yeah. And the things that I discuss about in the afterlife frequency, the electromagnetic soul, the collective consciousness, spiritual synchronicity, spiritual situational awareness, those concepts are also fundamental to the technology being developed for the soul phone. So like my dad said so many years ago, look, spirit communication is possible. Yeah. We just don't have the technology for it yet, but yes, we're gonna.
We're going to. Yeah. And when I hear that, actually that because I think one of the most cruel things about losing a loved one is that separation, that loss of connection. And so I think to me, this gives me hope. It really does. And you've taken time out of your, day to talk to us, Mark. I don't want to keep you too long. I've just so many questions, but I do have one last question for you. With all the readings that you've done and all the people that you've helped process grief, I know you've been by people's bedside while they were transitioning. Now, anything that you've learned that stands out to you that you want to share with us? Any insights, anything that can help us?
I think it cycles back to the message that my mother gave me, was that God exists. Now, when people think of God, and I saw a friend of mine was talking about God on Facebook, and this guy that's a so-called medium, and he's a witch and all that stuff, and that's a whole nother discussion. Oh, don't use that word. That's a Christian word. You're forcing it. Look, the word God is too limiting. I've had a near-death experience. I communicate with the other side. I've encountered the energy that we might call God. People, you have, it's like, yes, we all have. We all do. It's recognizing being open to it. The word God is too limiting. You can call it the divine power, the source, the energy, whatever you want to call it, exists. And I believe, once again, this is quantum physics. It's energy on a subatomic level that flows through us, around us, with us. People that come back from near-death experiences talk about the interconnectedness of everything in the universe. Well, there's quantum physics yet again. Everything's electromagnetic energy. Quantum entanglement. If you take one quantum particle and separate it, even though it's 1 billion miles from the other particle, if something happens to one, it affects the other. Ergo, always was, always will be, because according to Einstein's theory of relativity, on this subatomic level, time as we know it does not exist. And that's why psychics and mediums, we can tune into this quantum level and we'll pick up on future events. It isn't a demon coming in fortune telling. That's once again ignorance and fear turning it into a boogeyman, simply because the people that are spouting that stuff don't understand this. It's you're tuning into a quantum level and picking up on things that haven't happened yet. So God exists. Our souls, our electromagnetic soul is an eternal living being. We can communicate with those souls. And yes, everybody is capable of receiving messages from spirits. Is everybody a medium? No, but not everybody is an Olympic athlete. Not everybody can do calculus. Not everybody can be a world-class chef. We all have different abilities. Some people are better at it than others. And that we can not only communicate with these souls, but we will be reunited with our loved ones when it's our turn to quantum leap from our material world dimension to the other side, the afterlife frequency. So that's what I've learned, and I've seen this in so many readings. Earlier, Pooja, if I could, we were talking about deathbed visions before. Yes. A deathbed vision is a really fascinating phenomenon. And the study of near-death experiences has been going on in earnest since the 1970s. And an NDE is when somebody physically dies and their EMS, electromagnetic soul, leaves the body. They'll encounter loved ones who've passed. They will see what's going on around them, even miles away, and come back with accurate accounts. I mean, we could, once again, spend several shows on near-death experiences. But when somebody is in the active process of dying, so let's say somebody's in hospice and they're dying and their electromagnetic soul is getting ready to leave their body, its energy field begins to expand, and people in close proximity, be it healthcare workers, family members, close friends, their electromagnetic souls begin to interface with that of the person who is dying. And you, as an observer, and you're not in imminent threat of dying, will see some of the spirits that the person may be talking about that are coming to see them. And that's why it's called a shared death experience. And there's different types. But a deathbed vision is where a person's EMS and they're getting ready to leave their body, and the EMSs of other spirits are coming in, so their energies are overlapping. And that's why people on their deathbed will start talking to people who've died. In the past, it was called, it must be a side effect of a dying brain, it's hallucination. But many times what's being reported is very lucid. And when people who are in close proximity are also witnessing it, then it becomes objective. But there's two deathbed visions I do want to talk about before we go. And I'm not playing politics, I'm not getting involved in anything, but when George Floyd was being held down and that police officer had his knee on his neck, and people were filming this, recording this on their cell phones, and I watched this several times because I am a near-death experience researcher, and this is what I do, is I study this. And George Floyd, one of the last thing he said is, "Mama, I'm through." And I remember when I first saw it, I go, wait a second, what is that? And I went back and I looked at it, and he was very, very close to his mother who had died. And I believe that may be the most heavily documented deathbed vision in history, because we have it there on film or on digital, on video, before he died. And I remember when I presented this at the International Association of Near-Death Studies, there was a gasp through the whole room because the researchers were going, oh my God, I didn't even think of that. And then who doesn't remember Betty White? I mean, Since I was a little kid, Betty White was always on some television show. And I think she's probably best known for being Rose in The Golden Girls.
Girls.
Okay. But Betty White, she was an American treasure. And back in, I think it was back in the late 60s or early 70s, she met this guy named Alan Ludden. And he was a game show host. And they were inseparable. They married, they were the loves of each other's lives. She loved him so much. They did shows together. They were like, the super positive power couple in Hollywood. And then Alan Ludden died back in the 1980s. I think it was around 1984. Betty White spiraled into a horrific depression. She was so depressed. And she said Alan Ludden was the love of her life. And that's why she never married after he passed. And Betty lived to just shy of being 100 years old. And it was New Year's Eve of 2021, just about to become 2022. And Betty had been lucid and active right up to like a week or so before that. And she was laying in bed. And this is verified not only by her healthcare provider, but also by actress Vicki Lawrence, who was in a number of TV shows with her, like Mama's Family and Carol Burnett Show and all that. At the precise moment of Betty White's death, she looked up, opened her eyes, smiled, and said, "Alan," and then she expired.
Wow. Wow. You're right. Oh my God. Because, I have heard of people seeing loved ones before they pass, but those two are very documented. That's right. Yeah. And so again, I think you said it somewhere. It's like when before the light bulb is about to go out, it burns bright, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I explained the reasons for that and why that relates to the circuitry, the axons in our brain,
Yeah.
which, before an incandescent bulb burns out, it gets real bright and there's a flash.
Yeah.
Well, that also happens in our brain because the brain structures can no longer handle the amount of electrical flow going through the brain. The brain may only be 2 to 3% of the body's weight, but it consumes over 20% of the body's electromagnetic energy. Hello, because
Yes.
that's the spirit. And so when the brain ceases to function like tungsten in a light bulb, it can no longer handle the voltage. There's a surge of electromagnetic energy. And we have proof of this now. In Tartu, Estonia, on February 2nd of 2022, an 87-year-old man had a massive stroke. He was rushed to a hospital, was put on an EEG, electroencephalogram, to measure the 5 brainwave frequencies, gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. And then all of a sudden he had a massive stroke. Nobody has ever been on an EEG at the precise point of death before. And what occurred astounded doctors worldwide. Every one of the 5 brainwave frequencies surged, went off the charts. Then in November of 2022, the Grossman Center from NYU released a study conducted of over 500 people in the US and the UK who were undergoing CPR, and they had an EEG being administered. Now, here with the CPR, they were resuscitated. 1 out of 5 of them, 20%, who came back, reported a near-death experience. Their consciousness, their electromagnetic soul, leaving the body, encountering deceased loved ones, encountering the divine power. But 100% of them, at their brainwave frequencies, were surging off the scale. And Sam Parnia, the scientist in charge, said this may be the first conclusive proof of the existence of near-death experiences and that consciousness survives physical death.
That is awesome. That is absolutely awesome, Mark. Thank you so much. I don't want to let you go because I have so many questions, but
I'll have to come back.
Yes, you will have to come back. Do I have your permission before I close to read a quote from your book that has really deeply touched me?
Sure.
Okay, so
I'd be honored.
It's something that you learned from your dad, so I am going to read it. And this is what it says. And you say this: I now understand what my father was trying to tell me about parallel dimensions. The ocean truly is another world. We think of other dimensions as distant, inaccessible, and faraway places when they're actually right next to us. The ocean may be the best way to understand the difference between our world and the other side. Two systems teeming with energy very different, yet they coexist and overlap with each other. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for coming on the show. If somebody wanted to book a reading with you or wanted to, ask you for speaking, how is the best way that they can get in touch with you, Mark?
Well, it's the same as my web, the name of my book, afterlifefrequency.com. So kindly visit my website. You can, and I invite you to sign up for my newsletter. You can find out about scheduling a reading, booking me on, and if you're a producer, booking me on your show. You can find out about ordering my books there, and also for signing up for Best Holistic Life magazine, because I write for them on a monthly basis. And every Thursday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, I co-host The Psychic and the Doc. And my co-host, Dr. Pat Basile, is a world-renowned behavioral psychologist. People call in, I do a reading for them in tandem with her uplifting insights. And we are very honored to be there for you and to help so many people. And that's The Psychic and the Doc. And you can find out about all of that by visiting my website, afterlifefrequency.com.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I will include the link to your book in my show notes as well. Thank you once again for coming on air and talking to us.
Thank you.